Are we comfortable with death because our cultural worldview exists, right? And we're sort of living up to it? Or have we created cultural worldview to exist because it is a mechanism that now makes us feel more comfortable with death?
Terror management theory came out not as a death theory, but it came out as this answer to why do we need self-esteem, right? Why do we work so hard to have it? And then the other piece to it is, why do we have such a hard time living with other people?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Good People. This is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Lindsey Harvell-Bowman, where we talk about her work with existential psychology. We talk about death anxiety, suicidality, and all the work that she's currently doing with the Terror Management Lab. Due to the nature of this conversation, if you or someone you know are experiencing a mental health emergency, suicidal thoughts, or anything similar, support is available to you 24/7 through the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Call 988. There will also be resources available for you in the show notes below. As always, enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Can we talk about death now?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
Favorite topic.
You mentioned earlier, and I want to touch on this, that when you started studying death, it was sort of right place, right time. You were studying this thing, this mentor you had passed suddenly, and now you were wanting to sort of pursue this other avenue. Before that happened, though, did you give any thought to death on your own?
I mean, probably in passing, right? When people died, dogs died, right? Like, people die. But it wasn't something that was life-changing for me or something that I spent an enormous amount of time thinking about. Now, I think about it every day. I'd almost say that it's almost always conscious and certainly unconscious as well. My friends, I have friends outside of school, but I also have my colleague friends in communication, but then I have this whole group of existential psychologists as well, right? Including the founders of terror management theory. And so, we're able to talk about death and work on projects about death. So it's always there. It's there probably more than it is healthy to be.
Does it make you uncomfortable when you think about it as often as you do?
Oh, sure. Right. I think we just have ways of thinking about it differently. So we're thinking at it more on a meta level, right? Where we're running these experiments and things of that nature. And so we're thinking about it, but we're manipulating things and looking at causes and effects and things of that nature. So we're thinking about it, but not necessarily our own death. Now, inadvertently, we do think about our own death. COVID is a really good kind of case example of what happens when the death people have to do death when death never goes away. And it was really interesting to watch all of us kind of do our research, collect data in a world that was going through an existential crisis. It was a great time to collect data, and I wouldn't say a great time to be alive because it's weird, but it was interesting watching the world grapple with the very issues that we grapple with every day. The problem with us, though, is that usually we can do death, death, death at work. We come home, we get away from it. There's no getting away from it. It was on the news all the time. So I know a lot of us were feeling very burnt out about talking about death because, oh, by the way, everyone wanted to talk to all of us on top of it. So I always tell people that work in my laboratory, whether it be undergraduate or graduate students, and including when I teach existential psychology as well, I say, death is kind of this black hole, and you can sit on the edge of it. When you think about it, you can dangle your feet over the edge. You can look over the edge. Do not go in the hole, right? Do not go so far deep into thinking about your own death that you can't get out of the hole.
I have a question that I'm gonna sound like a lunatic for saying this, but I've always been curious about this, and you're the person to ask. When I was like 6 to 8, I'll use that age range, very young, very young. I remember laying awake in my bed at night, just thinking about the idea of me dying and like
Oh boy.
contemplating multiple uh, different results. Like, what if it's nothing? And then I would imagine what nothing was like, and I would get so scared that I would like almost cry. And like, should I go to my mom and dad? And then I would think about the reality of God and all this other stuff. Right? Is that normal behavior of a 6 to 8 year old?
I'm not in the position to say whether that's normal or not. I'm sorry, man. But I think that a lot of people probably grapple with it. I had a colleague in psychology that was telling me, and her kids were younger than that. And a few years ago, she had come up to me. She said, they're asking me about death. I think I'm just going to send them to you. I'm like, I don't think that's good. Like, maybe not send them to me. Maybe that's not a good choice for them. They probably will come home crying. But yeah, I don't know that that's normal necessarily, but it's interesting that you went through all of these different options, right? And you mentioned religion, which is a protection feature of fear of death, right? Like religion helps us feel better because, we die, but then we live eternally, right? And all of these different nothing. When you said nothing, it scared you greatly, right? Like to the point where you were almost crying. And so I think that's a big fear for people, right? None of us really know until we're dead what's going to happen after we're dead. So there's a lack of there's a level of uncertainty that is problematic for people.
I've always said that I'm good at thinking about death, which is like a weird statement, but I think it's because of that time when I was so young that I thought about it enough that maybe it's become a dull thing now for me. My girlfriend and I go back and forth all the time where like she's terrified of flying on planes. And this is one of the reasons, not necessarily
Oh,
that
I need
makes her
to
like,
not meet her then. I
yeah.
should never meet this woman.
Well, just because it's not necessarily the fear of death. It's a lot of other things. I think it's just like a scary thing, but I know that that's a thing for a lot of people. Just like doing what is a perceived high danger activity, making them in a weird way sort of think about death. And her mom, for example, her and I will talk very easily about our own death, what happens when we die. It's super comfortable. It's a super comfortable conversation for us to have with each other. And I'm curious if that is the thing that makes people comfortable with death. Is it just thinking about it long enough, or are there other features, personality traits that make some people more easily able to think about their own mortality?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is protection features, right? So we know that this theory called terror management theory that Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pazensky came up with, they talk about, and we talk about in our subsequent research about how we protect against this death anxiety. What happens, right, when this fear of death? And so one piece is self-esteem, right? So kind of, do you feel like you're making a meaningful contribution to the world? Do you feel like you're living up to whatever cultural standards are set forth for you by yourself or other people? If you feel like you are, then that's a protection feature, right? So maybe thinking about death, it doesn't affect you as much as, say, someone who is just not really killing it at life, no pun intended, right? So then, but you also have you also have things like religion and things like symbolic immortality as well, like leaving a lasting legacy, having kids, right? All of these things. You mentioned risky behaviors. And we know from a fair amount of research that risky behaviors is a form of protection against death anxiety. People will engage in risky behaviors. And I think a lot of that is because it's like, look, I jumped out of a plane and I could have died, but I didn't die. Or like that dude that was like jumping out from space from the Red Bull thing. I don't remember his name. But when I watched that, I thought, holy smokes, this makes me very nervous, right? But he lived, drinking and driving, texting and driving, all of that, gambling, right? buying luxury items, all of these things help you manage that.
And TMT, terror management theory, I'm not sure if you just mentioned it there. I heard a couple of the other terms, symbolic mortality, self-esteem, but no, I know you mentioned terror management theory. I'm not sure if you mentioned cultural worldviews. This
Yeah.
is I kind of want to break down terror management theory a bit more specifically for people listening, because I think it's a really good lens to frame the conversation that we're talking about. Could you explain what cultural worldview is?
Yeah. So terror management theory is a theory about the anxiety and the fear that happens when you want to live, but you know you're going to die, right? We're different as humans. And that's kind of what this theory says. Animals have death anxiety, but they don't have it until they're about to die. We have the ability cognitively to think about this far, far in advance, which is why we're having this wonderful conversation now, right? Like my dog is not going to have this conversation with you because she's not going to think about death until right before it happens. There's three components, right? I mentioned self-esteem, but when I mentioned self-esteem, cultural view is really kind of tied into that. Cultural view is your reality, all of how you were brought up, right? As Americans, we share kind of a common cultural view. I grew up in Kansas and Oklahoma. I have a different worldview of growing up in the Midwest than, say, someone that grew up in New York City, or maybe someone that grew up in Mexico or Europe, right? Like a lot of different things make up your cultural view, political views, any of that stuff, right? But cultural views set forth these kind of standards and beliefs of what you believe. They're different for every single person, right? That cultural view serves as a protective function against other people. So when we're aware of our own death and we think about it, one effect that we have is that we pull people who are part of our cultural view closer together and push people that aren't a part of our cultural view further apart. Think about 9/11. Think about what happened after 9/11. We became downright, there were stereotypes, racial stereotypes against people from the Middle East. It wasn't a particularly safe space right after 9/11 for Middle Easterns, but then we also came together in America in a way that I have never seen. We had the ability to do that with COVID, and that didn't happen. What happened? Well, people that wore masks loved each other and started attacking people that didn't, right? Or people from China started to get death threats, stuff like that. So that is a direct kind of reflection. The last piece of, awareness of death, the last piece to the theory is close relationships. The more you have, the better it is for you, right? Because those close attachments provide meaning into your life. There's a very quick, and very, very quick.
Yeah, and can I just repeat them to you? The three
Sure.
are it's cultural worldview. What was the second one?
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem. And then the last one, close relationships. Okay, mm-hmm. Very good. With the cultural worldview, I'm kind of talking my way to this question, and so hopefully it comes out correctly. But is cultural worldview to our own mortality and the idea of death, do we feel more comfortable with our own death because cultural mortality exists, or does cultural immortality exist? Or sorry, I'm misspeaking. Cultural worldview. I'm gonna rephrase it again. Are we comfortable with death because our cultural worldview exists, right? And we're sort of living up to it, or have we created cultural worldview to exist because it is a mechanism that now makes us feel more comfortable with death?
That's a really good question. That is a dissertation philosophical type question. I think there are people that are dead now. I'm thinking like Ernest Becker. I'm thinking other people that might some other existential philosophy types that might think that it's the latter, right? Like maybe we did create this. Maybe this didn't always exist. Maybe we as a society, the whole reason we cling so closely to our cultural views, maybe that is because of something else, right? From a terror management theory perspective, we would argue, and Ernest Becker would argue this as well, that, we do it as a management of our self-esteem, right? We manage this cultural worldview. It helps with our self-esteem. And then consequently, it has this effect on our death anxiety or protecting us against that. Terror management theory came out not as a death theory, but it came out as this answer to why do we need self-esteem, right? Why do we work so hard to have it? And then the other piece too is why do we have such a hard time living with other people? So that's really the real reason that terror management theory came to be. And then it just kind of morphed into everyone thinks it's a death theory, but really it's a theory about living, interestingly enough.
I think that kind of goes with some of the deeper questions of life, right? It's like, in reality, this underlying notion that we're all going to die is a very big driving force behind a lot of the decisions that we choose to make with our life and the things that we value. Because at the end of the day, it's probably accurate to say that we all want this to mean something and that we were here for some sort of reason, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was abstract, right? Until COVID. COVID, it was in people's faces. It was weird because, social media took this really strange thing where it was like we were watching what other people were doing, and then we were watching people die on Facebook. That was horrifying. I could not believe that people were live streaming their deaths, right? It was bizarre. And for the first time, you were afraid to leave your house because you didn't know if you could, pre-vaccinations, right? Like at the very, very beginning, you didn't know. And so that was the first time I think that we all as a global thing, everyone dealt with it. Every single person dealt with that level of death. Normally you don't deal with it unless it's like in your family or maybe you have a health scare or something like that. But this was, everyone was dealing with it. And you saw what happened. It wasn't good. We didn't handle it well.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of unprecedented, the amount of, it was probably similar at other times when there was mass death surging through the lands, but it's very rare for you to experience that much thinking of death all the time. It's in your face every day. It's about how high the death toll is going. You probably had people in your family that maybe not died, but were close, and then you worried about them, and then you had to sort of deal with that. I think about this all the time. I've never had anybody that I'm really close with die yet. Both my grandparents I'm very fortunate, are still alive.
Yeah.
I've had dogs, but not my dog yet. My dog that was my first dog is still around. So,
oh wow, yeah.
I'm somebody who's maybe I'm not good at thinking about death, and once I experience it for the first time, it'll sort of hit me, and I'll be thinking about it more. But yeah, it's very interesting that is something that we all kind of collectively went through, and I guess I didn't really think about it because for me, that time wasn't great. I didn't love the time period, but I got to go home and be with my family and spend time with my brother, who we had both been moved out of our house for the last 3 years. And we spent pretty much every day and worked out together and ate food together and watched comedy and had bonfires on the weekend. It was a good time for me personally. Right.
Yeah. I didn't mind it either. I love a good quarantine away from people. I like my husband, so it was fine. We also have our own space in our house. We just moved to a different house, but that house, he had the basement, I had the upstairs. It was very simple to get away from each other. Had we have been in a tiny apartment in New York City, it might have been very different. I think this idea of death and being comfortable with it is interesting. As a person who's very comfortable with it and gets accused by a fair amount of my family members as being death obsessed, right? But I'm just kind of comfortable with things. I'm also really interested in things like the death positive movement. I'm super interested in death doulas. I think that's a really amazing thing that people do for others. I have sat with people as they have died. That's something that I've done several times, whether it be, my husband's family members or, friends, families. It's just, I'm that person that they call. It's not that it's not sad. It is, but no one deserves to die alone, right? I took my graduate student, Peter, last year to see the cadavers at James Madison, and that was really interesting. Not a lot of people can do that. And just being comfortable with death. I think Caitlin Doherty has a really good book about all of the different death practices all over the world. Super interesting. I forgot what it's called, but definitely look it up. It's so good. If you're comfortable with that kind of thing.
Yeah, something you just said too that piqued my interest is you said there's a death positive movement. This is not something that I've heard before. What is that?
Yeah, so it is a movement that is focused on death positivity, right? Like thinking about, yay, we're gonna die. No, it's not like that. It's more or less not being so negative and talking about death. Death is something that, isn't, people don't want to talk about. People don't want to talk about the fact that in some crematories, you can push the button for your loved ones as they go through.
I thought you were going to say yourself, and then I thought about it for a second.
No,
I was like,
that would be weird.
I was like, that was a stupid thought. You can't do that if you're dead.
But your family can. And if they don't like you, they might like that. Or, death positive movement is really just kind of focusing on things like death cafes and really just, being open to all things surrounding death, whether it be the practice, the preparation, the after, the grief.
Did you say death cafe?
Yeah, they have death cafes and it's super interesting because you normally have just a whole bunch of people get together for food and to talk about death. And you usually have a number of different religious people that are there and, mortuary people, but also just people that want to talk about death. We haven't had one in Harrisonburg yet. I think we've had some in Charlottesville. I've not been to any, but you also have like the Right to Die movement as well that is kind of linked to that, but somewhat different, which is this idea of letting, should people who have terminal illness be able to take, medically assisted suicide is what it is, right? For people that have, terminal illnesses. What is it? Switzerland, I think now has these, they call them death pods.
Yes, that's
for people that want to end their own life. Yeah, that's super interesting. I don't think we're going to get that here, but
that is like the same thing as pressing your own incineration button.
Absolutely, that's as close as you can get to it. Yeah,
they should add that as a feature.
Yeah.
I don't know how it works. I would imagine they push something into the pod with you, right? Some sort of chemical, and then you die peacefully.
Well, it's gas, yeah, and you close it, and it starts the process. It's a painless process. I was reading about it because I thought it was like, oh, that's interesting. It was also just really sad. I mean, I was reading about it at the time we were doing some of our suicide research, so it was just a bit much at the time. But
they should add incinerators to that chamber so that way.
Yeah, I mean that's quick.
I'm going to kind of try to get us back on track a little bit with the TMT stuff. Self-esteem is the next level that we sort of need to talk about a little bit more specifically. I know you gave us a definition before, but just for the listener, could you give us another definition of self-esteem? I know it's very similar to how we think of self-esteem as a general term, but it's a little bit more specifically tied to cultural worldview. Is that correct?
Yeah. How do you live up to your cultural worldview? So an example that I use in the classroom is with students, right? So everyone has their idea of like what a good student is. And it's different for every single person, right? Some people might think, you know what? So let's say you're the person that says, to be a good student, and a lot of this comes from your parents, but some of it comes from within. I need to go to class every day. I need to study every night, and I need to get good grades on my exams. So if you're doing all of those things, you are living up to that cultural worldview. You're living up to those standards that are set forth for you, and you probably we would say that you would have high self-esteem because you're living up to those cultural standards. On the other hand, if you are a person like myself, an undergraduate that did none of those things, barely went to class, and we won't talk about what I was doing in lieu of going to class, but I had myself a very good time. I wasn't going to class. I certainly wasn't getting good grades on things, right? You would say that I had low self-esteem because I was not living up to what my parents expected of me. Certainly not. And I think probably unconsciously I wasn't living up to what I knew that I needed to do, but I just couldn't manage to do it, right? So that's how self-esteem and cultural view are tied. There's a little more nuance to it, but that's enough, I think, for the podcast for sure.
And just to clarify, right, the cultural worldview, obviously there are some, this is the nature versus nurture conversation. Another one of those things that there's not really a specific answer to, right? So in a lot of ways it is set based off of a lot of factors of where you grew up, with the family you were born into, but it's also largely controlled by what we value too, correct? So meaning if you didn't want to be a good student and you cared very little about that and you just wanted to have a good time and that's what you were doing, then you would have a high self-esteem. Is that correct?
You could. Yeah, it just kind of depends on what piece. That's the other complicated piece to cultural view is there's a lot of different aspects. So what aspect is salient at that time, right? You can make different aspects salient depending on the subject, right? So like if we're running a experiment about politics, we want to make your political ideology salient. We don't want you to think about something else. We want you to think about that. So it's situational.
And then how does close relationships tie into all of this stuff?
Yeah, close relationships weren't part of the original theory. They came about in, I think it was 2003 by Mikulincer, Hirschberger, and Florian. And they said that the more close relationships you have, the easier it is to manage that death anxiety. And I think a very simplistic way of explaining this is thinking, about your funeral. Right? Like if you have a lot of close friends, dying is sad, but that at the end of the day, like people are going to show up to your funeral. You will be missed, right? That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it are these close relationships give you meaning in life, right? They're your posse, they're your crew, they're your they're who you hang out with. They support you in good and bad. You know that you are not alone. The more that you have of those, the less alone you feel. And you don't have as much death anxiety. It's really existential.
Yeah.
In many ways.
I think that's very fascinating because if you put it in a very dumb guy language for somebody like me to understand, it's very simply like, you have these values. Are you living up to them? So are you, as an individual, you're doing a good job, but then you also have people to share it with. And so in a simple way, it's like, do what you think you should and what feels like the right thing to do. And then also pick the people that are in your life that you want to share those things with that will also say that they think you're doing a good job. And so I think that's a really nice, simple way to put it.
I agree. You should write that up.
I have it somewhere written. I say stuff like that all the time. That's kind of one of the natures of this podcast, right? There's so many things. I've always believed this. Not always, I guess. I probably didn't think about this when I was very young. When I was contemplating death in my bed at 6 years old, I probably wasn't thinking this. But there's so many things that you can do in life and ways to navigate this and that. But fundamentally, this podcast is called Good People. All you have to do is be a good person and strive for that. A really, I think, profound realization that I've come to recently that I really like a lot is I can't remember what sprung this thought, but I think it's more worthy to pursue goodness than it is to pursue greatness, because
Mm,
greatness is an individual thing that it's reserved for a very number one small number of people that have certain characteristics that will go above and beyond, but there's a level of selfishness to greatness, and goodness is a thing that I think is accessible to everybody. And I know I kind of went off on a tangent there, but that is kind of what I mean with to live a good life, be a good person, pursue goodness. And that's why I like having these kinds of conversations.
yeah, I think goodness also, greatness, just the word to me makes me feel like superiority to others. But goodness is just like, I'm just trying to be good as an individual, and I'm not trying to influence anybody. I'm just trying to live my life, which is what I strive to do every day. Don't hurt anybody, just exist.
Yeah.
Do good things.
Yeah. Have fun, but sometimes work hard, but sometimes
Sure.
enjoy yourself. It's a
Yeah.
weird balance that we're all shooting for. Symbolic immortality is something that I want to talk about. It seems a little bit different. I know it's obviously very much tied into some of the factors that we've been talking about, but are you living up to your expectations? Um, are you having people to share it with? How does symbolic immortality involve itself with all of this?
You will feel better about death if you believe you are leaving some kind of legacy. Professors have this down, right? People in academia have it down because they publish their work and they're cited for years, right? Well, after they're dead, they're still cited. Heck, Ernest Becker won a Pulitzer Prize after he was dead for the book Denial of Death. I highly recommend it. It is not an easy read. It's powerful, but that's a legacy, right? Building a nonprofit that's going to help people long in the future is a legacy. Your name will live on after you're dead. That's what symbolic immortality is, and a whole lot of people want it. Fame is all about that.
I don't know how to. You might not have an answer for this. I think that legacy is bullshit. Like personally, it's like a silly pursuit.
It is funny, yeah. It's so
Like
good.
it doesn't matter if I become a famous musician and my music lives on. When's the last time you thought about Prince?
During a tribute band a few weeks ago
Yeah,
when they played Prince. Yeah, I don't
good,
sit and think about Prince.
exactly. And like, I mean, when you heard he died, it was like, oh man. And then maybe you thought about it for a couple days. Kobe Bryant was a good one for me. I thought about Kobe
Yeah.
being dead for like the longest any big person in my life has ever I've ever thought about after they died. Probably about a week. Throughout the day, I was like, wow, Kobe Bryant is no longer alive. That's crazy. I'll think about Kobe Bryant from time to time, right? And in a way, his legacy is still living on. But it's unlikely that my children will care at all who Kobe Bryant is, right? And that
Yeah, you're not
generation.
doing this for you. I mean, you're not doing this for anyone else. You're doing it for you. It's for you to feel better, right? Like, it has nothing to do with anybody else.
I guess kind of my question though is like I understand that part of it. And I also understand like a desire to have a family and have kids is in a form leaving a legacy. But I guess personally I just don't think about it that way. Would you argue against my sort of rebuttal of like I don't care about leaving a legacy? Or is that sort of a common thing that maybe people say often?
Yeah, no, I think that that's not a way that you protect yourself against the fear of death, right? It works for some people. Legacy, symbolic immortality is really high against people with narcissism, right? People that need to feel better than other people that thrive on that, right? I'm not calling every professor a narcissist because that's not true, but there's a lot of people. So our suicide research I am not doing to build a legacy. I'm doing to save lives. It's different, right? I could care less whether I'm cited, whether I'm interviewed, whether, it needs to be published to get out into the world for the appropriate hands to have it. But if I save a life, that's what I care about.
Yeah.
And so I think I hear you with that. And no, I don't think you're wrong. I think there's just different types of people that strive for different things.
So symbolic immortality is just sort of one way to cope with anxiety. There's many others. I would agree with you. I feel like I have a similar purpose where a lot of the work that I do is to make people's bodies work better because I think it makes them interface with life better for longer. Like the thing that I'm concerned with,
longer, yeah.
Exactly. The thing that I'm concerned with is health span. The time that you're here, however long that is, that you can do the things that you want to do for as much of that time period as you can. And it's that exact reason of like, I don't care if you ever tell anybody that I helped you or whatever. I want you to just interface with this earth while you're here better than you would had you not done these things.
Yeah. And it's a rare, you do have some people, academia is full of people that need the attention, want the awards, want the publications. Do I publish a lot? Yes. Do I care? No. Right? Like I've never cared about that sort of thing. I do not care whether I get an award or not. That does not matter to me. What I care about is the work and saving people's lives and helping people. I could care less about the rest of it.
I want to talk to you about the work that you're currently doing in a second, and maybe you don't feel comfortable answering this question, and that's totally fine too. We can move on. But are there any like exercises that people who maybe struggle with death anxiety could do to maybe ease some of that? I understand this is a bit tricky territory, right? Because I don't want anybody listening to start thinking about their own death and then it make them spiral out of control, right? You use that peer over the cliff analogy earlier. I think that's a great way to put it. But are there any sort of exercises or strategies that are good for people to start thinking about death?
Yeah, there's a workbook by Rachel Menzies, Menzies. She is in Australia. Her and her dad have worked on the clinical side with death anxiety for years. So she came out with a workbook on kind of how to work through your own fear of death, and it's available on Amazon. And I highly recommend that. She uses cognitive behavioral therapy. She's a licensed clinician. And so I think that is the first of its kind to really come out and have a workbook that enables people to kind of work through these fears through a cognitive behavioral therapy model. So that's what I would recommend. I don't have any answers for you, but she has a lot of them and they're phenomenal.
I will link that in the show notes. I was listening to a podcast the other day and this guy was talking about a similar conversation of, I can't remember what the term is called, but he was in special forces and they made him like write his death letter before he went overseas because they were like, and he literally sat down and was like, oh, I actually might not come back from this. And anyways, it was just funny because he said, by the way, don't try to write your death letter, like especially if it's something that you struggle with. He was like, I'm not licensed to do this. I'm not responsible for you guys. And so I had heard that, and then it kind of clicked in my head of like, oh, this is probably something that I should be a little bit careful with when we talk about it on a podcast.
Yeah, I mean, if you're obviously having severe issues with fear of death and it's affecting your everyday life, you definitely need to see a licensed professional about that. So I think everyone needs a therapist. They're great.
Yeah, at least somebody to talk to for sure.
Sure.
I know you mentioned it before, Terror Management Lab. I really want to talk to you about your recent work, specifically with suicidality. Just touch on it again. What is Terror Management Lab and what's the kind of work that you guys have been getting involved with?
So Terror Management Lab is a lab that I started when I came to James Madison. It's an interdisciplinary lab. We house students. Most of our students come from the Department of Psychology. However, we do have some students from the School of Communication Studies as well. We had a graduate student in psychological sciences program, but also students within the advocacy master's program as well. So this laboratory, we focus on terror management theory and existential psychology, kind of issues of that. It's a way for me to engage graduate students, of course, in research, but really focus on also including our undergraduate research assistants. They present research, they publish with us. We take them all over the world. They're on international webinars. They do amazing work. And I think that so much of not all laboratories, but a lot of laboratories just look at undergraduates as kind of, they're just good enough for busy work. I think they're great. They're worth way more than that. And we do amazing things with them. And so we have a podcast ourselves and called Scared to Death. And we talk to people in, surrounding death and bring in interesting people. We do 2 suicide advocacy type events, one in the fall and then one with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in the spring. And so we really try to do our research, but also advocate for people so that we're taking it kind of one step further.
Is that advocacy work the suicidality work that you've been working on, or is that different?
So the suicide work that we've been doing recently really is more existential and clinical, but I'm always looking for graduate students that want to study mental health advocacy and bring them in through communication studies. And so it just kind of depends on which side they're coming in on.
Can we talk about the suicidality stuff with the more clinical side? What exactly is involved with that work?
Yeah, so I started this work when I was thinking about fear of death, and I was thinking, okay, we all have this evolutionary desire to survive. Like, how does this work, right? I was watching a documentary on the Golden Gate Bridge and people that jump, and I was thinking a lot about the few people that have survived, and it takes 4 seconds to reach the bottom. In the first 2 seconds of the survivors, they said, I felt relief that the pain was over, but then the last 2 seconds, I felt immediate regret. Like, maybe I shouldn't have done this. So I started thinking, well, how do we get them there, right? We can't put everyone in that situation. So is there a way, like, first, how are people getting around this fear of death to jump? If I was on a bridge, but I don't have suicidal ideation or SI, right? So I'm looking at it from a completely different perspective, but that would scare me greatly. It's not scaring them. So I went into my colleague Ken Critchfield's office when he worked at JMU, and I just started kind of talking to him about it, and this kind of led us down this path. We did our first study with undergraduate students. These people were either had a history of SI or they were currently experiencing SI. This was a pretty risky study. They weren't in therapy. We didn't follow them up. We didn't follow up with them, right? Our undergraduate students interviewed them. They were highly trained, by the way. And then we had a clinical graduate student with us, as well as Ken Critchfield, who was overseeing the whole thing from a licensure perspective. What we found in that first study was what we termed as a cognitive distortion. And what we found was that people who were experiencing SI, these undergraduates that were experiencing suicidal ideation, viewed their close relationships as problematic, and the one solution to make them better was to eliminate themselves from the relationship. So they viewed these relationships better off if they weren't in them. And that was something that we had not seen before. That idea this cognitive distortion was their cultural view. It was how they were getting around the fear of death and getting to the point of attempting suicide. So that was super interesting. What we wanted to then was look at this in a clinical sample. So we had funding from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and we were able to look at that with a clinical population. And we're still looking at the data and writing it up, but we found the same thing, right? So we're kind of looking at that in going into it further, right? And going into it deeper to hopefully kind of, okay, well, what does this look like in a therapy setting and that sort of thing. So that's, in a nutshell, we found other things, but that's the big piece of what we found and kind of where we're going with it.
That's kind of profound work, right? You know, like if you can sort of uncover what it is that is making people feel okay. I've never really considered it in that lens, right? Like you always hear in a lot of the dialogue in media, and it's great that people are drawing awareness to suicidality and suicide in general, is that it's these people are hurting so much, and you know, they feel as though they would be better off. It's a release. It's a relief for them to rid themselves from the world, right? And like,
Yeah.
that's a conversation worth having, but I've never really thought about it from that lens of like, it's that feeling of like, I would be better off is what is allowing them to overcome the fear of death. Like, because that's really, I guess, kind of intense, right? It's like, but anyways, I guess my question off of this is, it sounds like you're still kind of ongoing. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the one thing, you know, we've been focusing on terror management theory. Ken Critchfield's specialty is interpersonal reconstructive therapy, or IRT. And the one piece of where these two theories connect is close attachments. And so a lot of this is viewed through this attachment lens, right? Of kind of, how are these people seeing their attachments? But also this idea, and this is IRT language, but the idea that they're giving their close attachment a gift of love. They view suicide as this gift to them. Like, this is a horrible relationship. I am making it worse. I am going to take myself out of the equation because I love you that much, is just intense and something that is not accurate, right? So a lot of therapy involves kind of retraining the brain to rethink about their attachments differently. But, you know, it's fascinating.
Is your work focused at overcoming that too?
Not at the current moment, but probably in the future. Yeah, I mean, I think looking at kind of what is out there, we are a long ways from being able to kind of bring this in as a certain technique. The next step is to use a grant to investigate this in more clinical populations and kind of nuance it a bit more to try to understand it a bit deeper. The other piece that we're interested in doing is moving into Indigenous communities. So I'm a member of the Osage Nation, which is located in Oklahoma, specifically Northeast Oklahoma, around Pawhuska. And one piece is we would like to take our knowledge and go in and see how culture kind of affects that. So that is our plan. And then the other piece is to test these findings against traditional terror management measures, but that's rather boring. So I will not go into that. Just experimental work.
Yeah. This kind of popped up in my head, and because we're starting to talk about it, I'll also include any like suicide hotline number, things like that for anybody.
Yeah, but I was going to ask you to do a trigger statement at the beginning.
Yeah, for sure, I'll definitely include that. But is stuff like that, the hotline, other things like that? It seems like those are very obviously helpful resources, but and maybe I'm sure you're aware of this, but maybe not. Are there already sort of like surefire methods for how people navigate certain conversations with people that are dealing with things like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely trained professionals at these hotlines. They are all extremely trained, as well as anytime you go to the hospital for, an attempt, or you're concerned that you're going to attempt, there are people there that are trained and that are licensed to do that. I think, with our research, we did it. I should mention that we did it extremely safely. We had a plan, right? Um, we had every kind of scenario you could think of and a plan for that. Ken was right there the entire time. I was right there the whole time. Ken and I were viewing the interviews live, right? We were in a control room watching the interviews. We were so careful um, with everything. And that enabled us to sit with people. And what an amazing, meaningful experience to have these people be willing to share with us their stories, be with us at their lowest time, right? And probably one of the lowest parts of their life. And their stories are beautiful. And I know it's really kind of a weird thing to say, but it's the way that we get around being with, you know, something so heavy all the time. Not that they didn't affect me at all, right? But there were these, the reflectiveness and the meaning of some of these stories. And unfortunately, due to HIPAA, I can't really share details, but I can tell you that, they have changed my life, right? And just the empathy I now have for people who choose this, right? Who choose suicide and complete suicide and are successful in it, right? It makes logical sense as to why they chose a choice. So I am so grateful that they are willing to sit down with us. Like, really, truly, just the most amazing thing.
Yeah, and it sounds like you guys are doing amazing work. I think, and especially talking to you for the past almost 2 hours about this sort of thing, I think in a lot of ways it's good to the thing specifically I'm talking about is when you said you want to just make people have a better experience. I feel like that I can relate to a lot on that, and so conversations like this are very cool and rewarding to have for me, and motivating in that way, because it sort of gives me that fire to keep on the path. But we've talked a lot about death anxiety, something that we all have to face, suicidality, which again is heavy, and I will definitely include the warnings for people at the beginning of the episode. Something we've asked everybody, and I think that you are probably one of the most qualified people to answer this question, just because of the thought that you've given to literally living and dying, is what does it mean to be a good person? And so I'm going to ask you that. What do you think it means to be a good person?
Wow, that is a hard question. I think I don't want to put my viewpoints on other people. So I will say what it means for me to be a good person for me, right? I think living every day, doing what you can to help people, managing what gets thrown at you, right? In a graceful manner, but not being a doormat, right? There are times where horrible things happen to you for no reason, and you have to manage it and deal with it, right? Sometimes I have come out at the end of the day as a good person, and sometimes I have not, in regards to those things, right? Being graceful to yourself and knowing that you can make mistakes, but really just filling your life with things that give you meaning. So for me, being a good person means, spending time with my family, with my friends, checking in on them, being there for them when they're going through a tough time, being willing, and this is something that I continue to work on, being willing to have people come around you when you're going through a rough time, right? I have a horrible habit of isolating myself and not wanting to talk to anybody when I'm really going through stuff. So, and that includes my husband. So I'm trying very hard, but really just kind of you know, teaching my pound classes and walking the dog. And, we moved to a new house, and that's really exciting. And we have a beach place in Sandbridge. So going to the beach, and really, I spend a lot of time in the off season reflecting on the beach. Nobody's there. So, well, now I know my secret. You know where to find me in the off season. I'm sitting on the beach pondering my own mortality. But really just being grateful for every day. I think that's for me. And just being a good person means just treating people with respect. If I'm going off on a tangent, I'm not sure I'm really answering your question. Treating people with respect, being good to yourself too, treating your own self with respect, and living the life that you want to live, but not judging others for living whatever life they want to live.
Very good. I think that's a great answer. I know it's kind of one of those that's like, we interviewed somebody and was like, I don't like the term good because it's non-descriptive. And I was like, whatever, man, just answer the question.
Just answer the question, yeah.
Well, Lindsey, thank you for agreeing to do the show. This was a very cool conversation for us to have. I'm grateful for you for being able to do it. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we sign off?
No, thank you. And I really like the concept for this podcast, and I've listened to a few episodes and I'm going to continue listening. This is great. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. That made me feel good, and that made my whole week, and I'll just try to keep going.
Yeah, that's all we can do. Just keep going.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of Good People. If you guys are watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss next week's episode. If you really enjoyed it, please share it with somebody that you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time.